The funniest part wasn't that the HOA refused to pay my $63,500 repair bill. It was the look on their faces less than 24 hours later when every single luxury lake house they bragged about suddenly became inaccessible. The first thing I noticed that morning was the smell of wet cedar drifting across the shoreline as the sun climbed over Blackwater Lake. The air carried that clean mix of fresh water, pine needles, and cold stone that had greeted my family for nearly 70 years. Then came the low rumble of expensive SUVs rolling toward the private access bridge one after another. A white Escalade stopped first. Behind it, a black Range Rover, two lifted pickups, and a parade of golf carts stacked up along the narrow entrance road. Their engines idled. Their drivers leaned out their windows. Nobody moved another inch because the heavy steel security gate remained locked. Bright orange barricades stretched across the bridge, and a county-approved sign read, "Temporary closure. Structural safety inspection in progress. Authorized access only." 30 seconds later, I heard the unmistakable click of expensive heels striking concrete before I even saw her. Denise Whitmore, president of the Lakewood Shores HOA, marched toward the gate wearing a bright pink designer blazer that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. Gold jewelry sparkled in the morning sun. Oversized sunglasses hid half her face, and her perfume floated through the crisp air long before she reached me. Denise had mastered that special kind of smile that never reached her eyes, the kind people use when they're convinced rules exist only for everyone else. She planted both hands on her hips and demanded I unlock the gate immediately because, according to her, hundreds of homeowners were being inconvenienced. I simply folded the inspection notice back into my clipboard and looked past her at the line of frustrated residents stretching nearly a quarter-mile down the road. Nobody could reach their lake houses. Nobody could launch a boat. Nobody could unload groceries for the holiday weekend. And for the first time since I'd met Denise, she had absolutely no authority over the piece of property standing between her neighborhood and the water. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 46 years old, a licensed civil engineer, and the third-generation caretaker of the Walker Causeway, a privately owned bridge and access road my grandfather built in 1958 after returning home from the Army. Every bolt, beam, retaining wall, and drainage pipe along that entrance exists because someone in my family designed it, poured it, repaired it, and paid for it. While most people see a quiet bridge leading to million-dollar lake homes, I see decades of maintenance records, survey markers, expansion joints, drainage calculations, and thousands of hours of honest work. My father used to tell me that concrete never lies. Ignore small cracks today, and tomorrow they'll become expensive lessons. Turns out people aren't much different. Lakewood Shores wasn't always packed with vacation homes. Years ago, it was mostly forest, a handful of fishing cabins, and enough silence that you could hear loons calling across the water before sunrise. Then developers arrived. Bigger houses replaced cabins. Boat docks multiplied. Property values exploded. Somewhere along the way, the HOA started believing the bridge belonged to them simply because they drove across it every day. They never asked who inspected it. They never wondered who replaced damaged guardrails after winter storms. They never questioned why the pavement stayed smooth while every county road nearby developed potholes. They simply assumed someone else would always handle the hard work. That assumption finally produced a repair bill totaling exactly $63,500, neatly itemized, professionally documented, and delivered to the HOA board during what they expected would be another routine monthly meeting. They laughed before I had even finished explaining the engineering report. What Denise didn't know was that every joke she made that evening was about to become the most expensive mistake of her career. The truth is, I never wanted to spend my life maintaining a bridge. When I graduated from Texas A&M with a degree in civil engineering, I had offers from firms building highways, airports, and commercial developments across the country. The salaries were tempting, the projects were impressive, and everyone assumed I would leave our quiet lakeside property behind. But every time I pictured my future, I kept seeing my grandfather standing on this very causeway with a wrench in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, explaining that infrastructure is only invisible when someone is doing the job correctly. If people notice your bridge, he used to say, something has already gone wrong. After he passed away, my father carried that responsibility with the same quiet discipline. Every spring they inspected expansion joints after the freeze. Every summer they resealed concrete. Every fall they cleared drainage channels before the heavy rains arrived. Every winter they checked every support beam by flashlight if a storm rolled through overnight. When my father died unexpectedly 12 years ago, I inherited more than a piece of land. I inherited decades of maintenance logs, engineering drawings, inspection reports, insurance policies, easement agreements, and one simple promise. Keep the bridge safe, no matter who crosses it. That promise shaped every decision I made. I created a maintenance reserve instead of taking vacations. I replaced guardrails before they technically needed replacing because preventative work always costs less than emergency repairs. I hired licensed inspectors instead of cutting corners. I documented everything because concrete may not speak, but paperwork certainly does. Most residents never noticed. They drove across the bridge while sipping expensive coffee, towing wake boats worth more than my first house, never realizing someone inspected every inch beneath their tires several times a year. Honestly, I preferred it that way. Quiet engineering is successful engineering. The trouble began when Lakewood shores doubled in size. Construction crews started arriving almost daily. Cement mixers, landscaping trucks, roofing trailers, pool installers, moving companies, furniture deliveries, propane suppliers, and oversized utility vehicles crossed the bridge from sunrise until sunset. The causeway had originally been designed for residential traffic, occasional service trucks, and emergency vehicles. It was never intended to carry nonstop commercial loads every day for years. I started documenting increased wear almost immediately. Hairline surface cracks widened faster than normal. Drainage shoulders began settling. Protective barriers showed repeated impact marks from oversized trailers cutting corners too tightly. The vibration readings from several structural sensors slowly climbed above historical averages. None of it meant the bridge was unsafe, but every number pointed toward accelerated deterioration. I notified the HOA board with quarterly engineering summaries. I attached photographs, inspection reports, and maintenance recommendations. Every letter ended with the same request. We should discuss a shared maintenance agreement before future repairs become significantly more expensive. Most of those letters were never answered. A few received polite acknowledgments from the property manager. Denise never responded personally until she became HOA president 3 years earlier. Her first email contained exactly one sentence. Bridge maintenance remains the responsibility of the property owner. The association accepts no financial obligation. After that, her attitude only became more dismissive. Whenever we crossed paths, she spoke with the confidence of someone who believed repeating an opinion often enough eventually transformed it into law. She loved reminding neighbors that their association dues already covered enough expenses without paying for private infrastructure. Conveniently, she never mentioned that the bridge represented the only legal vehicle access to every lake house inside the community. Last spring, everything changed after an unusually wet season. Weeks of heavy rain saturated the soil beneath one retaining wall, while constant contractor traffic accelerated settlement near the eastern approach. During a scheduled inspection, I noticed fresh movement around several support bearings that had remained perfectly stable for years. The metallic scent of damp steel mixed with wet concrete as I crouched beneath the deck measuring tolerances with my laser equipment. The numbers were still within legal safety limits, but they were moving in the wrong direction. I immediately hired an independent structural engineering firm to conduct a complete evaluation. 3 weeks later, their report landed on my desk inside a thick blue binder. Estimated repair cost: $63,500. Every recommendation matched my own observations almost perfectly. Deferred maintenance under increasing commercial traffic had finally reached the point where waiting any longer would be irresponsible. I looked out across the calm water that afternoon, listening to waves tap softly against the old timber pilings my grandfather had installed decades earlier. I knew exactly what I had to do. The only question was whether the people benefiting from that bridge every single day would finally accept their share of the responsibility. I requested a place on the agenda for the next Lakewood Shores board meeting, and to my surprise, Denise approved it almost immediately. Looking back, I think she expected another homeowner asking for favors instead of someone carrying 3 binders full of engineering reports. The clubhouse smelled like fresh coffee, lemon furniture polish, and expensive candles trying a little too hard to make a budget meeting feel luxurious. Framed photographs of fishing tournaments and community picnics lined the walls, while board members chatted casually about landscaping contracts and holiday decorations. Nobody looked particularly interested when I rolled my cart to the front of the room. Denise sat in the center chair wearing another brightly colored designer outfit with a gold necklace resting over a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly insurance premium. She leaned back with folded arms, smiling politely in the same way someone smiles at a telemarketer they already intend to ignore. I thanked everyone for allowing me a few minutes before opening the first binder. The projector hummed softly as inspection photographs filled the screen. Close-up images of expansion joints, settlement measurements, drainage, erosion, traffic counts collected over 3 consecutive years, independent engineering recommendations. I avoided dramatic language because engineering does not need drama. Numbers tell their own story. I explained how residential traffic alone would not have accelerated deterioration at the current rate. I showed graphs documenting the dramatic increase after large-scale construction throughout the subdivision. Delivery trucks, contractors, moving vehicles, landscaping equipment, and utility trailers had crossed the bridge thousands of additional times compared with historical averages. The room remained quiet. Several homeowners nodded as they followed the charts. One retired accountant even asked thoughtful questions about maintenance schedules. For a brief moment, I honestly believed common sense might prevail. Then Denise cleared her throat. She thanked me for what she called my interesting presentation before asking a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. She wanted to know whether the bridge was currently considered safe for normal traffic. I answered truthfully, yes. It remains safe because inspections had been performed regularly and preventative maintenance had never been neglected. Denise smiled wider, turned toward the audience, and repeated only one word. Safe. It was remarkable how quickly she reframed the entire discussion. Instead of talking about shared responsibility, she focused entirely on the fact that the bridge had not yet reached an emergency condition. She suggested I was attempting to shift private business expenses onto homeowners who already paid generous association dues. One board member joked that owning lakefront access must be profitable enough to cover a few repair bills. Several people laughed quietly. Denise continued building momentum. She claimed the association had never signed any maintenance agreement and therefore owed absolutely nothing. Then she held up my invoice summary between 2 fingers as though it were junk mail. $63,500, she said with exaggerated disbelief. Perhaps next month someone else will ask us to replace their roof because our members looked at it too often. More laughter followed. The sound echoed against the clubhouse walls with a sharpness that surprised me more than I expected. I stood there listening to years of careful documentation being dismissed as if structural engineering were merely a difference of opinion. Fortunately, paperwork has never cared about applause. I calmly handed every board member a copy of the independent report along with photographs, inspection logs, and traffic studies. Denise barely glanced at hers before sliding it into a stack of unrelated papers. She called for a vote almost immediately. The motion to contribute toward repairs failed unanimously. Not $1. Not even an offer to discuss future cost sharing. Before adjourning the meeting, Denise looked directly at me and delivered the sentence I still remember word for word. If maintaining that bridge has become too expensive, perhaps you should consider selling it to someone who can afford it. The room emptied quickly after that. Folding chairs scraped across the floor, while conversations shifted toward weekend boating plans and an upcoming neighborhood barbecue. I packed my binders without saying another word. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air carried the scent of the lake mixed with freshly cut grass. Across the parking lot, I watched another oversized contractor truck rumble across the very bridge they had just refused to help maintain. Its heavy tires produced a deep vibration beneath the concrete that I could feel through the soles of my boots. That was the exact moment I stopped trying to convince them with emotion. From then on, every decision would be guided by contracts, engineering standards, and the law. The following Monday, I did exactly what every licensed engineer is trained to do when a structural concern is ignored. I documented everything again. Before sunrise, the bridge was wrapped in a thin layer of mist drifting across the lake, and the smell of damp concrete mixed with cedar filled the cool morning air. I walked the entire length carrying a clipboard, laser level, moisture meter, and camera. Every expansion joint received another measurement. Every drainage channel was photographed. Every retaining wall was checked against the previous month's readings. Nothing dramatic had happened overnight, but the trend remained impossible to ignore. Minor settlement had increased again. Surface cracking had spread another fraction of an inch near the eastern approach, where heavy construction vehicles entered almost daily. Those numbers might not mean much to most people, but to an engineer they were like hearing the first faint cough before a serious illness. Later that afternoon, another parade of contractor trucks rolled toward the subdivision. Concrete deliveries, roofing materials, landscaping trailers, and utility equipment crossed the bridge one after another. Each vehicle stayed within legal weight limits, yet cumulative loading tells a different story than a single crossing. Infrastructure ages through repetition as much as through extremes. I recorded traffic counts from the shoulder while diesel engines echoed across the water and the scent of fresh asphalt drifted from a nearby paving crew working inside the neighborhood. Several drivers waved politely. They had no idea why I was standing there with a clipboard. Denise noticed, though. She slowed her white Escalade beside me, lowered the window, and smiled with the confidence of someone convinced the argument had already been won. She asked whether I was still looking for someone else to pay my bills. I answered that I was simply completing another inspection. She laughed softly and told me not to worry because the association intended to keep using the bridge exactly as always. Before driving away, she reminded me that dozens of families depended on convenient access to their lake homes every weekend. That single sentence stayed with me long after her vehicle disappeared around the curve. Convenient access. Not legal access. Not guaranteed access. Convenient access. There is an important difference, and engineers tend to notice the exact meaning of words almost as much as attorneys do. That evening, I opened the original property files my father had organized decades earlier. Thick folders covered my dining room table. Survey maps, easement agreements, county permits, insurance correspondence, inspection certifications. The paper carried that familiar dry scent that only old record archives seem to have. I reviewed every page carefully, highlighting maintenance clauses and crossing permissions that had been updated through the years. The language was surprisingly straightforward. The causeway remained private property. Public travel rights had never been granted. Limited access existed only through recorded easements, and those easements required the owner to maintain safe conditions while allowing the owner to temporarily restrict vehicle traffic whenever structural integrity, repairs, or public safety reasonably required it. I read the paragraph 3 separate times before setting the document aside. There it was, written in plain legal language long before Denise ever moved into Lakewood Shores. My grandfather had anticipated this exact situation without ever knowing the names of the people who would eventually challenge his work. The next morning, I scheduled consultations with my attorney, my insurance carrier, and the independent engineering firm that had prepared the inspection report. I wanted every recommendation confirmed before making another decision. If I acted, it would be because the documentation supported it completely, not because frustration clouded my judgment. By the end of the week, every professional reached the same conclusion. Continued unrestricted traffic while repairs remained unfunded increased both financial exposure and long-term structural risk. For the first time since this dispute began, I stopped wondering whether the association would eventually do the right thing. Instead, I started preparing to fulfill the responsibility my family had carried for generations, even if that responsibility led to a decision the entire neighborhood was about to remember for a very long time. The consultations took most of the week, and every conversation pushed me toward the same unavoidable conclusion. My attorney spread the easement agreements across his conference table while sunlight reflected off rows of framed legal certificates behind him. He read every clause twice, underlined several paragraphs with a yellow marker, then leaned back in his chair without saying a word for nearly a minute. Finally, he looked at me and asked a simple question. "Ethan, are you trying to punish these people, or are you trying to protect your property and limit your liability?" The answer came easily. I told him I had no interest in revenge. I simply refused to become the person blamed if years of ignored maintenance eventually created a preventable problem. He nodded slowly and slid one document toward me. Under both state law and the recorded easement language, Temporary closure for necessary structural evaluation or repair was entirely reasonable if supported by licensed engineering recommendations. My insurance carrier reached the same conclusion later that afternoon. Their risk manager explained that allowing unrestricted traffic after receiving independent warnings could expose me to serious financial consequences if further deterioration occurred. Those words stayed with me during the drive home. Responsible ownership sometimes requires unpopular decisions. That evening, I walked the shoreline as the last orange light settled across the lake. The water lapped softly against the old timber pilings while the smell of pine and cool freshwater drifted through the evening air. Families relaxed on distant docks. Children skipped stones across the calm surface. Boats returned slowly toward covered slips. None of those people looked like enemies. Most of them probably had no idea their board had rejected every opportunity to share responsibility for the only access routes serving their neighborhood. That realization bothered me more than Denise ever had. I decided to make one final attempt before taking any formal action. The next morning, I sent a detailed letter by certified mail to every member of the HOA board. Attached were updated inspection photographs, the independent engineering report, correspondence from my insurance carrier, and a proposal that would spread repair costs fairly over several years instead of requiring immediate payment. I even offered to contribute a substantial portion myself despite the accelerated were clearly resulting from increased community traffic. The proposal was practical, transparent, and far more generous than my attorney believed necessary. 3 days later, Denise replied with a single page on official association letterhead. She thanked me for my continued interest in community cooperation before stating that the board unanimously reaffirmed its previous decision. The association would contribute nothing toward maintenance of privately owned infrastructure. She also included one additional sentence that revealed exactly how confident she had become. Any interruption of homeowner access will be considered intentional interference with community property rights. I read that sentence twice before placing the letter beside the easement agreement she had obviously never reviewed. Community property rights. The bridge was not community property. It never had been. Every recorded survey, every county filing, every title policy, and every engineering permit proved exactly the opposite. Denise had mistaken repeated convenience for legal ownership. That misunderstanding was about to become extremely expensive. I spent the following several days preparing quietly. I hired a licensed traffic control company instead of temporary laborers. I ordered professionally manufactured barricades that complied with state transportation standards. I reserved portable message boards, reflective warning signs, and temporary fencing approved for roadway closures. My engineering firm finalized a written recommendation supporting immediate repair scheduling, while my attorney drafted formal notices for every affected property owner explaining the temporary restriction and the legal authority supporting it. Nothing was rushed. Nothing relied on emotion. Every document was dated, signed, copied, and organized into binders just as my father would have done. Late Friday afternoon, I stood alone at the entrance to the causeway listening to wind move through the trees above the bridge. The steel rail reflected the fading sunlight, and somewhere across the water a boat horn echoed briefly before fading into silence. I rested one hand on the weathered guardrail my grandfather had installed decades earlier and realized this bridge had carried generations of families safely because someone had always been willing to make difficult decisions before small problems became dangerous ones. On Monday morning, I intended to honor that tradition, whether the Lakewood Shores Board appreciated it or not. Monday arrived with the kind of quiet morning that usually promises an easy day. A thin layer of fog floated just above the surface of Blackwater Lake, softening the outlines of the distant docks while the scent of cool water and cedar drifted through the still air. By 6 o'clock, my engineering consultant, the traffic control supervisor, and my attorney were already standing beside me at the entrance to the causeway reviewing the final checklist one last time. There were no raised voices, no dramatic speeches, and no surprises. Every permit had been confirmed. Every notice had already been delivered by certified mail and electronic copy. The county transportation office had acknowledged the temporary traffic control plan. My insurance company had received the repair schedule. Even the local sheriff's office had been provided copies of the engineering recommendation in case deputies received calls from frustrated residents. I wanted every question answered before anyone had the opportunity to ask it. At precisely 6:30, the crew began positioning reflective barricades across the entrance. Portable electronic message boards lit up with bright amber letters announcing temporary access restriction, structural repair, and safety evaluation. Authorized personnel only. Fresh orange cones stretched neatly along the shoulder, while temporary fencing guided approaching vehicles into a safe turnaround area. The metallic click of adjustable barricade legs echoed softly across the bridge as workers tightened every locking pin according to specification. By 7 o'clock, the access road looked less like the entrance to an exclusive lakeside neighborhood and more like a professionally managed construction zone. Exactly as it should. The first homeowners arrived only minutes later. Most slowed down, rolled their windows open, read the notices, and looked confused rather than angry. Several recognized me immediately. One elderly couple asked whether someone had been hurt. I explained that inspections had identified conditions requiring immediate repair planning and that temporary access restrictions protected both public safety and my legal obligations as owner. They thanked me politely before turning around without complaint. That interaction reminded me why I had spent so much effort documenting everything. Most reasonable people simply wanted honest information. Around 7:45, the atmosphere changed. Long before I saw Denise's white Escalade, I recognized the distinctive sound of its large engine approaching faster than normal traffic. Gravel crunched sharply beneath the tires before the vehicle stopped only a few feet from the first barricade. Denise stepped out wearing a bright floral designer jacket, oversized sunglasses, and enough expensive perfume that even the cool lake breeze could not completely carry it away. She looked from the warning signs to the locked security gate, then directly at me with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief in only a few seconds. She demanded to know who had authorized the closure. I calmly handed her a folder containing the engineering report, the temporary traffic control authorization, the inspection recommendation, copies of the easement provisions, and the legal notice that had been delivered to the board 3 days earlier. She barely glanced at the first page before insisting that homeowners had every right to enter their properties immediately. My attorney quietly stepped beside me and pointed to the highlighted easement language, explaining that temporary restrictions related to structural safety had always been part of the recorded agreement governing access. Denise insisted the association had never agreed to such terms. My attorney replied with remarkable patience that recorded easements remain enforceable whether later board members remember reading them or not. More vehicles continued arriving behind her until a line of luxury sport utility vehicles and pickup trucks stretched down the entrance road. Some residents stepped out to read the posted notices for themselves. Others began asking Denise questions she could not answer. They wanted to know why repairs had become necessary. They wanted to know why the association had refused repeated requests to discuss maintenance. Most importantly, they wanted to know how long they would be unable to reach their lake houses. Denise looked back toward me as though expecting I would suddenly change my mind under public pressure. Instead, I simply opened another binder and showed the original maintenance correspondence, engineering reports, certified mail receipts, and board responses rejecting every proposal. The morning remained surprisingly calm despite growing frustration. Nobody shouted for very long because every accusation was answered by another dated document. Every complaint met another signed report. Standing there beside the bridge my grandfather built, listening to the gentle sound of water against the pilings beneath the deck, I realized something important. Facts have a remarkable way of lowering the volume in any argument. They do not need emotion. They simply wait for their turn to be read. By mid-morning, the line of waiting vehicles had grown long enough that local news crews began appearing with cameras balanced on their shoulders. They had probably expected a dramatic confrontation, but what they found instead looked almost disappointingly organized. Reflective barricades stood exactly where the traffic control plan required. Safety signs were visible from every approach. County permits rested inside clear plastic sleeves on a portable information board. The steady hum of generators powering the electronic message signs blended with the gentle sound of waves brushing against the shoreline. Even the smell in the air reflected preparation rather than chaos. Fresh coffee drifted from a catering truck serving the construction crew, while the scent of damp concrete lingered beneath the bridge after the previous night's light rain. Denise clearly hated every minute of it because there was nothing for her to point at as improper. She walked from sign to sign with a cell phone pressed against her ear, speaking first with the property management company, then with attorneys, then with board members who had suddenly stopped answering quickly. Every few minutes, another homeowner approached her with a question she could not answer. Why had nobody mentioned these engineering reports during board meetings? Why had certified letters never been shared with residents? Why had the association refused to negotiate if the bridge truly needed repairs? I remained near the temporary office table reviewing inspection schedules while my attorney answered legal questions one document at a time. Shortly before noon, two sheriff's deputies arrived after receiving multiple calls from frustrated homeowners. Their patrol vehicles rolled quietly into the turnaround area, lights off, creating an atmosphere of routine professionalism instead of emergency. One deputy introduced himself, accepted the folder my attorney handed him, and spent nearly 15 minutes reading through the easement language, engineering recommendations, and temporary closure notices. The second deputy walked the bridge with my engineering consultant, examining photographs that matched the documented areas requiring repair. When they returned, the senior deputy thanked everyone for remaining cooperative before explaining to the gathered residents that no criminal issue existed. The property owner had followed the recorded legal process, professional engineering recommendations supported the temporary restriction, and the matter was civil rather than criminal. A silence settled over the crowd unlike anything I had experienced since this dispute began. Denise immediately objected, insisting the neighborhood had been held hostage by unnecessary repairs. The deputy politely replied that disagreement did not invalidate recorded property rights or licensed engineering opinions. Several homeowners looked directly at Denise after hearing that answer, and for the first time I noticed uncertainty replacing the confidence she had worn for years. The questions coming from residents became far more direct. One retired contractor asked whether the board had actually received my maintenance proposals months earlier. A woman who owned one of the larger lake houses wanted to know why the association had never informed members about the potential liability. Another homeowner quietly asked if refusing to contribute toward maintenance had ultimately caused the closure everyone was experiencing now. Denise attempted to redirect the discussion toward inconvenience. But inconvenience suddenly sounded insignificant beside documented engineering reports and certified correspondence. My attorney opened the final binder containing copies of every letter I had sent during the previous year. Each page carried mailing receipts, delivery confirmations, photographs, inspection summaries, and reasonable cost-sharing proposals. The evidence formed a timeline so complete that no explanation could erase it. Watching those homeowners turn the pages themselves reminded me of something my father often said whenever people argued with measurements. Opinions can be debated. Records cannot. By late afternoon, the board requested an emergency executive meeting inside the clubhouse located just outside the restricted area. This time they invited my attorney and me to attend. As I gathered the binders from the folding table, I looked once more toward the bridge stretching across Blackwater Lake. Sunlight reflected gently across the guardrails while the same structure that had quietly served generations of families now stood exactly as it always had, strong, dependable, and supported by careful maintenance instead of assumptions. The difference was that everyone could finally see the value of work that had remained invisible for decades. Sometimes the strongest position is not the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it is simply the person who kept every receipt, every report, and every promise long before anyone realized they would matter. The emergency board meeting lasted nearly 3 hours, and not once did I raise my voice. I did not need to. The conference room overlooked Blackwater Lake through floor-to-ceiling windows, where late afternoon sunlight shimmered across the calm water as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt completely different. The smell of stale coffee mixed with fresh printer toner as board members shuffled through stacks of documents they should have read months earlier. Denise occupied the same chair she had confidently controlled during the previous meeting, but now she spent more time staring at the engineering reports than at the people around the table. Every few minutes, another homeowner quietly entered the room after receiving permission from the board. Several had already reviewed the correspondence outside while waiting near the bridge. They no longer came looking for someone to blame. They came looking for answers. My attorney began with a simple timeline projected onto the screen. Every inspection, every maintenance recommendation, every certified letter, every offer to share costs, every written rejection from the association. The presentation contained no dramatic language, only dates, signatures, delivery confirmations, and professional engineering findings. When he finished, the room remained silent long enough that the faint hum of the air conditioning became the loudest sound anyone could hear. One homeowner finally broke the silence by asking Denise whether the board had truly received all of those documents before voting against repairs. She hesitated for several seconds before admitting that the reports had been distributed to board members but were considered unnecessary because the bridge remained open at the time. That answer immediately produced another question. Why were homeowners never informed about the potential liability? Another board member quietly admitted that discussing possible repair costs before the annual budget meeting might have been unpopular. The words hung in the air with an uncomfortable weight. Unpopular had now become unavoidable. My engineering consultant calmly explained that deferred maintenance always becomes more expensive than preventative maintenance. He displayed photographs comparing the bridge from 5 years earlier with current inspection images. The differences were measurable, documented, and entirely consistent with increased traffic loading. He emphasized that the structure remained fundamentally sound precisely because inspections had never been neglected. Temporary restrictions allowed repairs to proceed before more extensive work became necessary. One retired architect sitting near the back slowly nodded while studying the comparison photographs. He looked around the room and quietly said that if the owner had ignored those warning signs instead, everyone would probably be criticizing him for negligence. That observation shifted the conversation more than any legal argument had. Suddenly, the discussion was no longer about inconvenience. It became about responsibility. Denise attempted one final defense by suggesting that future legal action might still force the bridge to reopen without payment. My attorney responded by placing the recorded easement documents, insurance correspondence, engineering recommendations, and state statutes side by side across the table. Then he explained, with remarkable patience, that litigation would likely extend the closure while dramatically increasing legal expenses for every homeowner involved. The room grew even quieter. Several residents exchanged long looks before one of them asked the question Denise had avoided from the beginning. What would it cost to resolve everything today? I slid a single page across the table. The original repair estimate remained $63,500. I had not added penalties, interest, administrative fees, or attorney expenses despite every opportunity to do so. I also confirmed that once funding was secured, repairs could begin immediately and the bridge could reopen as soon as the engineering team confirmed safe operating conditions. A retired school principal folded her hands on the table and looked directly at the board. She said she had joined the association expecting transparency and responsible management, not expensive pride. One by one, other homeowners agreed. The conversation no longer belonged to Denise. It belonged to the people she had promised to represent. By the end of the evening, the board voted again. This time the decision was unanimous in the opposite direction. The association authorized full payment of the repair costs, accepted responsibility for future shared maintenance discussions, and instructed legal counsel to finalize the agreement before the end of the next business day. As everyone slowly gathered their papers, I looked through the clubhouse windows toward the quiet bridge standing in the fading sunlight. It had not changed at all. The only thing that had finally shifted was the willingness of people to acknowledge the value of protecting it before waiting for a far more expensive lesson. The repair work began 2 days later under clear blue skies. The steady rhythm of construction equipment replaced the endless arguments that had filled the previous week. Fresh concrete carried that unmistakable earthy scent my grandfather always associated with progress, while welders carefully reinforced the support assemblies exactly according to the engineering specifications. I spent nearly every daylight hour on site alongside inspectors, contractors, and survey crews, watching each phase unfold with the same quiet satisfaction I remembered seeing on my father's face decades ago. There was something deeply reassuring about solving a problem with craftsmanship instead of conflict. Every bolt was torqued to specification. Every drainage channel was restored. Every expansion joint was replaced with modern materials designed to serve another generation. Nobody rushed the work simply because people were impatient. Safe infrastructure has never cared about deadlines nearly as much as it cares about doing the job correctly. Several homeowners stopped by throughout the week, not to complain, but simply to ask questions. Many admitted they had never realized the bridge had always been privately owned, or that one family had quietly maintained it for more than 60 years. A retired firefighter shook my hand and thanked me for refusing to ignore the inspection reports even when doing the responsible thing made me unpopular. Another resident apologized for believing the early rumors before seeing the documentation for himself. Those conversations meant far more to me than any legal victory ever could. Trust, once rebuilt, feels remarkably similar to rebuilding concrete. It takes patience, careful preparation, and a willingness to fix small problems before they become permanent damage. Denise appeared only once during construction. She arrived without the confidence that had once announced her presence from half a parking lot away. The bright designer outfits had been replaced by a simple sweater, and even her voice sounded quieter than I remembered. She stopped beside the temporary fence, watched the crews for a few minutes, and finally admitted that the board should have listened to the engineering reports the first time they were presented. I thanked her for saying so. There was nothing left to argue about because the bridge itself had already answered every question more clearly than either of us ever could. 3 weeks after the closure began, the final inspection was completed. The county inspector reviewed every report, walked the full length of the causeway with my engineering consultant, and signed the approval documents before noon. I unlocked the security gate myself. The hinges moved smoothly with a familiar metallic click that echoed gently across Blackwater Lake. One by one, the waiting vehicles crossed the bridge again, this time over a structure stronger than it had been in years. Several drivers slowed just enough to wave. Others simply smiled as they rolled past. No speeches were necessary. The bridge did exactly what it had always been built to do. It carried people safely home. A month later, the Lakewood Shores annual meeting produced another surprise. Homeowners elected an entirely new board committed to publishing engineering reports, sharing financial decisions openly, and creating a long-term infrastructure reserve fund. One of their first official actions was approving a permanent maintenance agreement so future repairs would never depend on pride, assumptions, or unnecessary conflict. When they asked whether I would serve as an independent engineering advisor without joining the board, I accepted, not because I wanted authority, but because good planning is always easier than expensive repairs. Sometimes I still walk across the bridge just before sunrise, listening to the water brush gently against the pilings while cool lake air carries the scent of cedar through the trees. I think about my grandfather's words more often than ever. Infrastructure is only invisible when someone is doing the job correctly. The same can be said about integrity. Most people never notice it until the day it disappears. If there is one lesson this entire experience taught me, it is that justice does not always arrive with raised voices or dramatic courtroom moments. Sometimes justice arrives as a signed engineering report, a well-organized binder, a properly recorded easement, and the quiet determination to protect what is right even when standing alone. I would love to know what you think after hearing this story. Do you believe the bridge should have been closed the moment the repair recommendations were ignored, or would you have handled it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely enjoy reading how different people see situations like this. And if stories about standing up for what is right through patience, preparation, and the law are the kind you enjoy, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. Around here, justice is never the loudest voice in the room. It is simply the one that is prepared when the truth finally arrives.